In a small village nestled beside a winding river lived a young woman named Ilara. Her home was a simple collection of houses, surrounded by fields that stretched toward ancient, whispering woods. Life here could be peaceful, filled with the hum of bees and the laughter of children playing by the water's edge. But this peace was often broken by the shadow of their ruler, a man known only as the captain. He was a stern figure, with a face like thunderclouds and a voice that could make even the bravest villager tremble. The captain's rules were harsh and his temper was quick, making every day feel like walking on thin ice for the villagers. Ilara, however, was different. While others bent their heads low when the captain passed, Ilara often met his gaze, not with defiance, but with a quiet strength that seemed to hum beneath her skin. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. She wasn't outwardly rebellious, but there was a deep well of power within her that few understood. From a young age, she had been stronger than any of the boys her age, able to lift heavy sacks of grain with ease or pull a stubborn cart out of the mud all by herself. Her hands, though calloused from work, were also gentle when she tended to a bruised animal or helped an elderly neighbor. She wasn't boastful about her strength. In fact, she tried to keep it hidden, knowing that anything different often drew the captain's unwanted attention. She preferred to spend her days working hard, helping her family, and exploring the quiet corners of the forest. The villagers saw her as kind and dependable, a steady presence in their uncertain world. Yet, some whispered about her unusual might, a power that seemed to ripple just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The captain, in his arrogance, had not yet truly noticed Ilara, seeing her as just another quiet villager. But that was about to change. Each morning, Ilara rose with the sun, her days a steady rhythm of work and quiet observation. She helped her mother grind grain into flour, her arms moving the heavy millstone with an ease that made her mother smile with a mix of pride and worry. Later, she would carry buckets of water from the river, 2 at a time, without a single drop spilling, while other young men struggled with just one. She often spent hours in the fields, pulling weeds or helping with the harvest, her strong back bending and straightening without tiring. But Ilara's strength wasn't just in her muscles. It was in her heart, too. She was the first to offer help when someone was sick or needed an extra pair of hands. When old Master Finn, whose back was bent with age, dropped his basket of apples, Ilara was there in a flash, gathering them carefully and carrying the basket all the way to his door. She would share her meager meals with hungry stray dogs and always had a kind word for the shyest children. This kindness, combined with her quiet power, made some villagers a little nervous. They weren't sure what to make of someone so strong yet so gentle. The village elders, in particular, watched Ilara with thoughtful eyes. They had seen many things in their long lives and knew that unusual gifts often came with unusual troubles. They worried that her strength, so carefully hidden, might one day draw the wrong kind of attention, specifically the captain's. They knew the captain valued obedience above all else and crushed anything he saw as a challenge to his power. Ilara tried to blend in, to be just another villager. But her very nature, her quiet power and deep kindness, made her stand out. She was like a bright star trying to hide behind a cloud. But her light was too strong to be completely dimmed. While Ilara quietly went about her days, a heavy cloud hung over the village, cast by the captain's cruel grip. His rules were not meant to help the village, but to keep everyone in fear and under his thumb. Every week, he demanded a large portion of the harvest, leaving families with barely enough to eat. If a farmer dared to complain that their crops had failed due to bad weather, the captain would simply laugh, then order his soldiers to take even more, sometimes even their tools or livestock. He had a special cruelty for the old and the weak. Old man Tiber, who could no longer work in the fields, had his small pension cut by the captain because he said Tiber wasn't contributing enough. Widow May, whose husband had died defending the village in an old skirmish, was forced to pay extra taxes simply because she had no one to stand up for her. The captain loved to parade his power, often holding public punishments for small mistakes, like forgetting to bow low enough or speaking out of turn. He would make the person stand in the sun for hours, or sometimes even hit them with a stick, all while the other villagers watched in terrified silence. His soldiers, big and brutish men, followed his every command without question. They would swagger through the village, taking what they wanted, pushing people aside, and making sure everyone remembered who was in charge. The captain's word was law, and there was no one to argue with him. He had convinced himself, and tried to convince the villagers, that he was the only one who could keep them safe, even as he was the one making their lives miserable. Alara saw all of this, her kind heart aching for the suffering around her. She often wished she could do something, anything, to ease their pain. But she knew that acting out could make things even worse for everyone. The captain's unfairness was a constant, heavy weight on the village, pressing down on every soul, especially the most vulnerable. One sweltering afternoon, the usual quiet of the village square was shattered by the captain's booming voice. He stood on a makeshift platform, his soldiers flanking him, their spears glinting in the sun. Before him, trembling and hunched, was old Master Borin, a kind woodcarver whose hands now shook too much to hold his tools steady. Borin had failed to deliver the number of carved wooden bowls the captain had demanded, claiming his eyesight was failing. "You call this an excuse, old man?" The captain sneered, holding up a poorly carved bowl for all to see. "You waste my time and my wood. You are useless." He then ordered Borin to stand on a single leg in the middle of the square, holding the crooked bowl above his head. "Stay there until sunset, or receive a dozen lashes," he bellowed, his voice echoing. The villagers watched, their faces pale with pity and fear. No one dared to speak or even move, knowing the captain's wrath. Old Master Borin, his face red with shame and effort, wobbled precariously. His old leg was weak, and it was clear he wouldn't last long. A collective gasp went through the crowd as Borin's leg gave out, sending him tumbling to the dusty ground, the bowl clattering beside him. Before the captain could even open his mouth to declare a punishment, Ilara moved. She had been watching from the edge of the crowd, her heart aching for the old man. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her quiet strength suddenly making itself known. She walked directly to Master Borin, gently helped him to his feet, and then stood between him and the fuming captain. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the stunned silence. "He is old and frail, Captain," she said, looking directly into his angry eyes. "He has served this village well for many years. This punishment is too harsh." The crowd held its breath, certain she had just sealed her own terrible fate. A hush fell over the square, so deep you could hear the distant buzz of a fly. The captain's face, usually set in a sneer, twisted into a mask of pure rage. His eyes, small and dark, narrowed on Ilara. No one had ever dared to challenge him, especially not a young woman, and certainly not in front of the entire village. His chest puffed out, and he took a step down from the platform, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden steps. "Who do you think you are, girl?" he roared, his voice shaking the very air. "Do you dare question my judgment? Do you dare stand against my command?" He pointed a thick, angry finger at her. "You are just a villager, a common peasant. You have no right to speak." Alara stood her ground, her gaze steady, even as a shiver of fear ran down her spine. She knew the danger she was in, but seeing old Master Boren's tear-filled eyes behind her gave her courage. "I speak for what is right, Captain," she replied, her voice still calm, though a little stronger now. "Kindness is not weakness, and cruelty serves no one." The captain's face turned a deep shade of red. He was not used to such defiance. His soldiers, who had been standing stiffly, now shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. They had never seen their captain so openly challenged. This was an insult to his power, a crack in the wall of fear he had built around the village. He stomped closer to Alara, his shadow falling over her. "Right?" he scoffed, a venomous sound. "I decide what is right, and you, girl, have just decided your own punishment." He raised his hand, not to strike, but in a gesture of absolute fury, his eyes burning with a terrible anger. He saw not just a disobedient girl, but a threat to his entire reign. The captain's fury burned, his eyes like hot coals. He took one more heavy step, bringing him nose to nose with Alara. The air crackled with his anger. Instead of speaking or even striking, he pulled back his head slightly. Then, with a disgusting sound, he spat directly into Alara's face. The glob of spittle landed on her cheek, wet and cold, running slowly down her skin. It was a vile, deliberate act, meant to degrade and humiliate her completely in front of everyone. It was not just an insult. It was an attempt to crush her spirit, to show all the villagers that even their brave Alara was nothing but dirt beneath his boot. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. It was a sound of horror, outrage, and deep, aching pity. Even the captain's own soldiers flinched, some looking away, for such an act was considered the lowest of the low. Master Boren cried out softly from behind Alara, a sound of pure despair. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with shock. Everyone stared at Alara, waiting to see what she would do. Would she cry? Would she cower? Would she finally break under the captain's cruel hand? For a moment, Alara stood perfectly still. The spittle felt like fire on her skin, but it was the searing shame, the utter disrespect that truly burned. Her mind raced, a mix of disbelief and rising fury. The captain smirked, a cruel twist of his lips, believing he had won, that he had put this defiant girl in her place. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. For a heartbeat, Alara felt nothing but cold shock. The wetness on her cheek, the stunned silence of the crowd, the captain's cruel smirk, it all seemed a blur. It was as if time itself had stopped, leaving her suspended in a moment of utter disbelief. She had expected anger, perhaps a blow. But this deeply personal, degrading insult was worse than any physical pain. Her mind struggled to grasp what had just happened. Her vision blurred for a second, and she felt a tremor pass through her body. Then slowly, the shock began to melt away, replaced by a growing heat. It started in her stomach, a small spark, then spread quickly through her chest and into her arms and legs. It wasn't the burning shame she had felt before, but a different kind of fire. This was anger, pure and fierce, unlike anything she had ever known. It bubbled up from deep inside her, a powerful force that pushed aside all fear, all hesitation. her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. Her jaw tightened, and her gentle eyes, which usually held such kindness, now blazed with a dangerous light. The captain, still smirking, misinterpreted her stillness. He thought he had broken her, that she was about to cry or shrink away. He had made a grave mistake. The quiet girl who hid her strength was gone, replaced by a force of nature that had just reached its breaking point. The insults to her village, the cruelty to Master Borin, and now this personal degradation, it all crashed together, fueling a rage that simmered just below the surface, ready to explode. The air around Alara seemed to thicken, charged with the power she had so long kept hidden. The captain, still smirking at Alara's silent reaction, was about to turn away, satisfied with his cruel display. But he was too slow. In a blur of motion, faster than anyone could follow, Alara's hand shot out. Her fingers, strong and quick, wrapped around the front of his heavy tunic just below his collar. The captain, a big, imposing man, was caught completely off guard. He barely had time to register her movement before her other hand grabbed the back of his belt. Her grip was like iron. The captain, who usually felt so powerful, suddenly felt like a puppet caught in a child's grasp. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion and a flash of alarm. He tried to pull away, to push her off, but her hold was unyielding. The sheer force in her hands was astonishing. He was a man accustomed to having his way, to seeing people shrink from his touch. Now, he was the one being held, powerless. The villagers gasped again, this time not from shock at the captain's act, but from sheer disbelief at Alara's sudden, incredible move. They had seen her strength in simple tasks, but never like this. Her anger, simmering for so long, had exploded into action. The quiet girl was gone, and in her place stood a woman radiating raw, focused power. Her eyes, still burning, were locked onto the captain's, and for the first time, he saw not a peasant, but a formidable opponent. His soldiers, who had been lazily watching, now jolted forward, but they were too far, too slow. Alara had already begun to move, her muscles coiling and flexing with a strength that defied her gentle appearance. She wasn't just holding him. She was preparing to do something much more. With a primal roar that surprised even herself, Alara tensed her powerful muscles. The captain, a man heavy with armor and pride, suddenly found his feet leaving the ground. Alara, with what seemed like no effort at all, lifted him clean into the air. He hung there for a moment, suspended between her fierce grip and the sky, his eyes wide with utter shock and disbelief. His boots dangled uselessly, his arms flailed, and his mouth opened in a silent, choked gasp. The sight was so unbelievable, so contrary to everything the villagers had ever known, that a new wave of gasps swept through the square. Children covered their mouths, their eyes like saucers. Adults stared, some rubbing their eyes, wondering if what they saw was real. A slender young woman, barely half the captain's bulk, was holding him aloft as if he were a sack of feathers. The sun caught the sweat on Alara's brow, but her face was set, grim and utterly determined. There was no strain, no wobble in her stance. This was her true strength, unleashed and undeniable. The captain, for the first time in his life, was truly afraid. He had always relied on his size, his soldiers, and the fear he commanded. Now, all of that meant nothing. He was utterly at the mercy of this peasant girl he had just humiliated. His face, usually red with anger, turned pale with terror as he looked down at the ground, then up at Alara's blazing eyes. Her grip on his tunic and belt was so tight, it felt like his clothes would tear. This was not the kind, gentle Elara they knew. This was a force that had been pushed too far. She held him high, letting the moment sink in for everyone, especially for the man dangling in her hands. The message was clear. His power was gone, and hers had just begun. With the captain still dangling helplessly in her grasp, Elara spun. It was a swift, powerful turn, her body a coiled spring releasing all its stored energy. The captain let out a small, desperate cry as he was flung through the air. He soared across the dusty parade ground, his arms and legs flailing like a rag doll. He was not thrown gently. Elara put every ounce of her anger and strength into that toss. The captain flew over the heads of the stunned villagers, past his own bewildered soldiers, who finally seemed to snap out of their shock, but were too late to do anything. He traveled a surprising distance, a heavy, armored blur against the afternoon sky. Then, with a loud, resounding thump, he landed in a cloud of dust near the far edge of the parade ground. The sound was like a heavy sack of stones hitting the earth, echoing through the sudden silence. He didn't move right away. He lay there, a crumpled heap of cloth and armor, making no sound. The dust settled slowly around him, like a shroud. The villagers were frozen, their mouths agape, their eyes fixed on the spot where the mighty captain had fallen. They had seen him march, shout, and command, but never had they seen him fly through the air like a toy. Elara stood breathing a little heavily, but her stance was firm. Her chest rose and fell with the effort, but the anger in her eyes had not faded. She looked at the fallen captain, then at the villagers, her gaze daring anyone to question what they had just witnessed. The message was unmistakable. The balance of power in the village had just shifted dramatically. The man who had spat on her, who had ruled with fear and cruelty, was now nothing more than a lump in the dust. The silence that followed the captain's heavy landing was profound, like the world itself had held its breath. Villagers stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief, their minds struggling to make sense of what they had just seen. The mighty captain, who had terrorized them for so long, lay like a discarded toy in the dust. Then a small sound broke the stillness. It was a gasp, a soft, shaky intake of breath from someone near the front. Another followed, and another, growing in volume. These weren't gasps of horror, but of dawning realization, of sudden, hopeful shock. Their eyes moved from the crumpled captain to Elara, standing tall and strong, her chest still heaving slightly. A whisper started, then grew into murmurs. She did it. She threw him. Elara! It was old Master Boren, tears streaming down his face, who let out a choked sob of gratitude and joy. His voice, weak though it was, seemed to break the spell. Suddenly, a child, bolder than the rest, let out a tiny, triumphant hooray. That single sound was like a spark in dry tinder. In an instant, the murmurs exploded into a wave of sound. First, it was a collective roar of disbelief and amazement. Then, it quickly changed into shouts of joy. Elara! Elara! People cried, their voices filled with a mix of awe and pure happiness. Cheers erupted, louder and louder, filling the square. People began to clap, then to stomp their feet, their faces alight with a hope they hadn't felt in years. They surged forward, not towards the fallen captain, but towards Elara, their liberator. The fear that had gripped them for so long was suddenly, wonderfully, gone. The captain lay in the dust, a heap of crushed pride and bruised bones. His helmet had flown off, revealing a bald head shiny with sweat. He slowly pushed himself up onto an elbow, groaning softly. His eyes, usually so full of fire, darted around, confused and disbelieving. He patted himself, checking for broken bones. But it was his mind that truly felt shattered. He had never imagined such a thing could happen. He, the mighty captain, tossed like a toy by a mere girl? The idea was so outlandish, so humiliating, that he almost couldn't believe it was real. But the ache in his back, the grit of dust in his mouth, and the sudden, loud cheering from the villagers told him it was all too true. He looked toward the crowd, expecting to see fear, but instead saw faces alight with joy and excitement, all turned towards Alara. And then he saw Alara herself, standing strong and tall, looking directly at him. Her eyes still held that dangerous spark, and for the first time, a real shiver of fear ran down his spine. It wasn't just the fear of being hurt, it was the fear of losing control, of being seen as weak, of having his entire world turned upside down. He had always believed himself to be the strongest, the one who made everyone else afraid. Now, he was the one feeling afraid, not of his soldiers, but of the quiet girl who had just launched him across the square. The cheers grew louder, a sound that usually pleased him when they were for him, but now felt like a painful roar of mockery. He tried to stand, wobbling unsteadily, his mind racing to understand how to fix this, how to regain his lost power. But as he looked at Alara, he knew that the fear he had used to rule was now gone, broken by one strong girl and one powerful toss. As the cheers for her swelled, Alara turned her gaze back to the captain. He was still struggling to get to his feet, a pathetic sight compared to the towering tyrant he had been moments before. She stood perfectly still, her shoulders back, her head held high. The last traces of fear, which had lived deep within her for so long, had vanished with that powerful toss. Her heart beat strong and steady, no longer trembling in the face of injustice. Her face, usually soft and kind, was now etched with a firm resolve. There was no anger left, just a calm, unwavering determination. She had faced her fear, and she had won. Her eyes, once filled with a dangerous spark of fury, now held a clear, steady light. The light of someone who knew her own power and was no longer afraid to use it for good. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking justice and freedom for her people. The captain finally managed to stand, leaning heavily on one knee. He looked up at Alara, his eyes narrowed, trying to find a flicker of hesitation or weakness in her. But he found none. What he saw was a young woman who had transformed from a quiet villager into a leader, a protector. Her presence alone seemed to command the square, silencing the last echoes of his authority. The very air around her felt different, charged with a new kind of power, one built not on fear, but on strength and courage. She was no longer just Alara. She was the symbol of hope, standing tall against the darkness that had plagued their village for too long. As the villagers cheered, a different kind of silence fell over the captain's soldiers. They stood rigid, spears still in hand, but their eyes darted between their disgraced leader and the triumphant Alara. Their faces, usually grim and unmoving, now showed a mix of confusion and fear. They had served the captain because he was strong, because he was powerful, and because they feared his punishments more than anything. But now he lay defeated, humbled by a young woman they had barely noticed before. Their orders were to protect the captain, to enforce his will. But what were they supposed to do when their leader was thrown across a field like a toy? Who did they obey now? Should they rush forward, attack Alara, and try to restore their captain's pride? Or should they just stand still, hoping not to draw attention to themselves? They looked at each other, silent questions passing between them. Their bravado, which had been so easy to show when the captain was in charge, now felt very thin. One soldier, a burly man named Grunt, nervously adjusted his grip on his spear. He glanced at the captain, who was still trying to dust himself off, looking weak and foolish. Then he looked at Alara, standing firm, surrounded by the hopeful cheers of the villagers. He remembered the stories of her quiet strength, now proven to be true in the most dramatic way. The power had shifted, and they all felt it. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also men who understood when a battle was lost, even without a single sword being drawn against them. They were unsure, afraid of the angry villagers, afraid of Alara's power, and now no longer afraid of their own defeated captain. They simply waited, their spears pointing aimlessly at the ground. Alara raised a hand, and the joyful clamor of the villagers slowly died down, replaced by an eager, expectant silence. Every eye was on her, waiting. She looked out at their faces, seeing not just the lingering traces of fear, but also a new, bright spark of hope. "My friends," she began, her voice clear and strong, reaching every corner of the square. It was a voice they had heard in quiet kindness, but now it carried the weight of a leader. "Look at him," she said, pointing to the captain, who was now fully upright but still leaning heavily, looking small and defeated. "Look at what fear has done to us, and look at what one act of courage can do." She continued, her words painting a picture of a better future. "For too long, we have lived under a shadow. We have given too much, suffered too much, and always been afraid. But that ends today. The captain's power was only as strong as our fear. And today, our fear is gone." A wave of agreement rippled through the crowd. Many nodded. Some whispered, "Yes." The children, who had been hiding behind their parents, now peered out, their faces full of wonder. "You do not have to be scared anymore," Alara stated simply, her gaze sweeping over each person, making them feel seen and understood. "We are strong, together. We are kind, together. We are free together." Her words filled the air, not with demands, but with a promise that the heavy burden of fear had been lifted, and a new day had truly begun for their village. The villagers stood taller, their shoulders straightening, as her words sank deep into their hearts. As Alara's words echoed through the square, a remarkable change began to sweep through the crowd. It wasn't a sudden burst of shouts, but a slow, quiet awakening. The villagers, who had spent so long with their heads bowed and their eyes downcast, began to lift their chins. Their shoulders, usually slumped with the weight of worry, straightened one by one. Old Master Boren, tears still wet on his cheeks, pushed himself up fully, standing as tall as his old body would allow. A young mother, who usually kept her children hidden, now held her daughter's hand and looked at Alara with shining eyes. The farmers, the weavers, the blacksmiths, all of them felt a warmth spread through their chests, a feeling they hadn't known in years. Courage. They looked at the captain, no longer with terror, but with a mix of pity and quiet disdain. He was just a man, after all, and a bruised one at that. He had no power over them if they simply refused to be afraid. The children, sensing the shift, started to giggle, pointing at the captain with newfound boldness. It was a tiny sound, but it spoke volumes. The villagers exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. They were not just individuals anymore. They were a community, united by a shared moment of bravery and a new leader who had shown them the way. They had seen Alara's strength. and now they felt a spark of that strength in themselves. They stood taller, not because Alara told them to, but because they genuinely felt it from within. The heavy cloak of fear that had covered their village for so long was finally lifted, letting in the bright light of a new, brave day. Slowly, painfully, the captain finally managed to pull himself upright. He brushed dust from his uniform, his movements stiff and clumsy. He tried to look fierce, to regain some of his old authority, but his eyes darted nervously, and his face was pale. The confident sneer he usually wore was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief and a deep, gnawing shame. He looked at his soldiers, expecting them to rush to his side, to offer him support or to attack this defiant girl. But they stood frozen, their spears pointed at the ground, their faces as unsure as his own. They no longer looked at him with respect or even fear, but with a strange mixture of pity and confusion. The captain realized, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that their loyalty had vanished like smoke. Then he looked at the villagers. They weren't cheering loudly anymore, but a quiet hum of victory filled the air. Their eyes, once downcast, now met his with open challenge, some even with a hint of scorn. The children, who used to run and hide, now pointed and whispered, no longer afraid of his imposing figure. He was no longer the all-powerful captain. He was just a man who had been defeated in front of everyone. The air around him felt different. It was no longer thick with fear, but with a new sense of freedom and a quiet strength he couldn't control. His commands, which once made people jump, would now fall on deaf ears. He had lost his power, not just over Alara, but over every single person in the village. His reign was over, not with a great battle, but with one simple, powerful toss. He stood there, bruised and alone, a shadow of his former self, stripped of all respect and authority. With the captain standing defeated and his soldiers looking lost, Alara turned her full attention to the villagers. Her voice, calm but firm, once again filled the square. "The time for fear is over," she said, her gaze settling on the faces of her people. "Now is the time for fairness and for working together." She then began to speak of new rules, not harsh commands, but guidelines meant to help everyone. "From this day forward," she declared, "no one will go hungry while others feast. The harvest will be shared, enough for every family to thrive, with a small portion set aside for those who cannot work." A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. This was so different from the captain's greedy demands. "Our elders, who have given so much wisdom, will be cared for and respected, never shamed." She continued, looking at old Master Borin, who nodded, his eyes shining. "And our young ones will learn, not just how to work, but how to read and write, so they may build a brighter future for us all." She spoke of justice, saying that disagreements would be settled with talking and understanding, not with punishments and fear. Alara's words were like cool water after a long thirst. They spoke of hope and a new way of life. The villagers listened, their hearts swelling with gratitude and trust. They saw in her not just a strong woman, but a wise and caring leader, someone who truly wanted what was best for them. Her rules were simple, fair, and filled with kindness, showing everyone that a village could be run with a gentle hand and a strong heart. This was the true beginning of their freedom, guided by Alara's clear vision. As Alara finished speaking, a joyful noise swelled up, much louder and more heartfelt than before. It wasn't just cheers now, it was a celebration. The villagers, freed from their long fear, embraced each other, laughter mingling with happy tears. Children ran in circles, their faces bright with a wonder they had never known. Old Master Borin wiped his eyes, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his wrinkled face. Someone started a simple drumbeat, and soon others joined in with claps and foot stomps. The square, which had been a place of dread, turned into a lively festival. Food that had been hidden away was brought out and shared freely. Musicians, who had long kept their instruments silent for fear of the captain, now played lively tunes. People danced, sang, and spoke loudly, their voices full of a freedom that felt almost unbelievable. They gathered around Ilara, not in fear, but in deep gratitude and joy. They touched her arm, offered her flowers, and thanked her again and again for her bravery. She smiled, a true happy smile that reached her eyes, reflecting the joy of her people. It was a celebration of new beginnings, of hope reborn, and most of all, of the courage of one young woman who dared to stand up against a tyrant. The fear that had once been a heavy chain around their hearts had been broken, and in its place was the light of freedom. The entire village rejoiced, their happiness a bright flame burning away the last shadows of the captain's cruel reign. Amidst the joyous celebration, Ilara turned to the captain, who stood alone and defeated, his face a mask of shame. "You and your men are no longer welcome here," she stated, her voice calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. "Leave this village and never return." The captain, for once, had no angry words, no threats. His eyes, full of a deep, bitter humiliation, scanned the faces of the villagers. They met his gaze, no longer flinching, no longer afraid. He saw only their newfound courage and their unwavering trust in Ilara. He knew his reign was truly over. He turned to his soldiers, who were still standing in a confused huddle. "Move!" he barked, his voice weak and raspy, a pale echo of his former roar. Without a word, the soldiers lowered their spears. Their helmets hid their faces, but their slumped shoulders showed their defeat. They had no leader to follow, no fear to enforce. One by one, they turned and slowly began to walk away, heading towards the village gates. The captain, with one last, lingering look of hatred at Ilara and the celebrating villagers, followed them. He walked with a limp, his head bowed, his armor clanking softly with each step. The once proud group, who had marched into the village with such arrogance, now slunk away, their backs to the cheers and laughter. They were a defeated army, driven out not by swords, but by the courage of a single woman and the newfound freedom of a united village. The villagers watched them go, a quiet sense of triumph filling the air as the last of the captain's men disappeared from sight, taking with them the last shadows of tyranny. With the captain and his soldiers finally gone, a true calm settled over the village. But it was a calm filled with joy and purpose. Ilara, the quiet girl who used to try and hide her strength, now stood as their clear leader. The villagers, old and young, looked to her with deep respect and trust. They had seen her unmatched strength, yes, but they had also seen her unwavering fairness and kindness. She didn't demand obedience like the captain. Instead, she listened. She held meetings where everyone's voice was heard, from the oldest elder to the youngest farmer. She organized the sharing of harvests and made sure that those who were sick or old received help. Her decisions were always made with the good of the entire village in mind, not just for herself or a few powerful people. Ilara proved to be a leader, unlike any they had known. She was strong enough to protect them, but gentle enough to care for them. Her hands, once just skilled at farm work, now guided their community towards a brighter future. People from neighboring villages, hearing the amazing story of how she tossed the captain, came to see her. They left inspired, spreading tales of Alara, the strong and fair leader of the Riverbend village. She became known not just for her incredible power, but for the wise and just heart that guided it. The fear of the past was replaced by a strong, loving bond between the villagers and their new, respected leader. Under Alara's wise and gentle hand, the village began to blossom. The fear and hardship that had once shadowed every home faded away, replaced by a vibrant sense of community and peace. The fields, no longer overworked for the captain's greedy demands, yielded abundant harvests. Villagers worked side by side, singing as they toiled, knowing that their efforts would now benefit all. The children, once quiet and watchful, now played freely in the square, their laughter echoing happily. A small school was built, where old Master Borin, his eyesight now aided by Alara's careful tending, taught the children to read and write, sharing stories of bravery and kindness. The elders were looked after with love and respect, their wisdom sought out and valued. Homes that had been neglected were repaired, and new ones were built with shared effort. The river, once a source of worry for its heavy water buckets, now sparkled under a sky free of gloom. Traders from faraway lands, hearing of the peaceful and prosperous Riverbend village, came to trade their goods, bringing new and exciting things to the market. Alara made sure that everyone had enough to eat, a warm place to sleep, and a voice in how their village was run. She walked among her people not as a ruler, but as a friend and guide, always ready to lend a strong hand or listening ear. The village became a shining example of what a community could be when led with fairness and courage. A truly happy and safe place for everyone. It was a place where kindness was stronger than cruelty, and where every day felt like a gift. In the flourishing village, Alara often spent time with the children, not just teaching them about growing food or helping neighbors, but about something even more important. She would gather them under the big oak tree in the square, her voice soft but clear, and tell them stories. These weren't just any stories. They were tales of everyday heroes, of small acts of kindness, and of people who stood up for what was right. She taught them that true strength wasn't just about muscles, but about having a brave heart. "It's easy to be mean or to give up when things are hard," she would say, her eyes twinkling. "But it takes real courage to be kind when someone is sad, to share what little you have, or to speak up when you see something unfair happening." She would tell them how she herself had once been afraid. But that kindness to Master Borin had given her the courage to face the captain. Alara wanted the children to grow up without fear, but also with a strong sense of right and wrong. She showed them how to help each other, how to solve problems with words instead of shouts, and how to forgive. She taught them that a village thrives when everyone looks out for one another, like a big, loving family. The children, with their bright, curious eyes, listened closely to Alara's lessons. They saw her strength and her kindness every day, and they learned from her example that these were the most important gifts they could carry. They grew up knowing that being kind and brave wasn't just a good idea. It was the very heart of their happy, safe home. Years passed, and the village continued to flourish under Alara's loving care. The sounds of laughter and singing filled the air from sunrise to sunset. Children grew into kind and brave adults, carrying the lessons Alara had taught them in their hearts. The harvests were always plentiful, and no one in the village ever went hungry. On warm evenings, Alara would often sit by the river, watching the stars come out. The gentle breeze would carry the happy sounds of her village, the chatter of friends, the lullabies sung to babies, the distant melody of a flute. Her face, though a little older and marked by the sun, held a deep sense of peace and contentment. She was no longer just Alara, the strong young woman. She was the heart of the village, its protector, its guide, and its greatest hero. She sometimes thought back to that day in the square, the captain's cruel spit, and the explosion of her hidden strength. It had been a terrible moment, but it had led to so much good. It had shown her, and everyone else, that even the quietest person could hold incredible power, especially when fighting for what was right. The story of the captain spit in her face, then she tossed him across the parade ground, became a legend, told around campfires and whispered to children at bedtime. It was a story not just about strength, but about how kindness can spark courage, and how one person's bravery can free an entire community. Alara, watching over her happy, thriving village, knew that her life's purpose had been fulfilled. She was a true hero, living peacefully among the people she loved, her legacy blooming as beautifully as the fields around them.